Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Susan Theriault. I am the principal investigator for the Restart Network, and I'm very excited to share the information in this webinar today with each of you. Just as a little bit first, we're going to start off with about the Restart Network. So the Restart Network is funded by the U.S. Department of Education Institute for Education Sciences. And it was really designed to fill a specific need in the pandemic recovery efforts. And so primarily, we are looking at coordinating research activities across 5 research teams. And we are with purpose bringing together researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and leaders to have conversations about the evolving needs and the research needs, as well as research findings with each of the network members. So I just want to make sure that you all understand that we're really unique in that way, where we're bringing folks together to continue to have these discussions as we all try to navigate this post-pandemic aftermath and supporting students and our educators. Next slide, please. So you might wonder, what are the key activities of the Restart Network? One of the key elements of, in order to have this cross-sector collaboration, one of the key elements of our work is to hold regular convenings. We hold convenings of our Restart Network core research teams, a few of which you'll hear from today, as well as supporting and training early career researchers. Further, we've been, since March 2020 and the onset of the pandemic, we have been doing work to synthesize research and findings across the nation, and putting that together into a database that you can search by geography, so state and or type of area of focus, for example, student well-being, or educator pipeline types of activities that's available on our website, which we'll share at the end of this. The other piece that we do that's really critical is this national forum. And the national forum brings together researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to have regular discussions about what's going on, what they're seeing, and what the priority of needs are. If we've learned nothing in the 2 years that we've been doing this work, we know that those needs have changed and evolved over time. And it's been really important dialogue to understand the nuance of the needs in the field. And it's been critical to how our research teams have shaped their work moving forward. And so the last part of this work is disseminating what we're finding. And so this webinar is a good example of that type of work. And we really welcome multiple perspectives, and you'll see that in what we're about to show you today. Next slide, please. So we have 5 core research teams, as I mentioned. They are all also funded by the Institute for Education Sciences. They are they're from throughout the United States, and they're covering different areas of focus and priority. Today, you're going to hear from 2 of them, the Chicago Skyline Early Literacy Team and the California Expanded Learning Opportunities Team. One thing that I really want to emphasize here is each of these individual teams are representing research practitioner partnerships. So they are researchers working shoulder to shoulder with policymakers and practitioners, just to design the work, identify priorities, make sure you're informing what is needed in the field, and interpreting and understanding the nuances of those findings so that they're supportive of efforts to improve student outcomes ultimately. Next slide, please. So, about today. So this is part of our effort to reach a wider public. We want to share what we're learning so far. And I will say one thing that we've learned about this journey is that we are continuing to learn about what these needs are and understand them in new and different ways. And I'm sure each of you have started to understand the aftermath of the pandemic similarly. So today is a good representation of these shifts that we're noting. And you'll see that it's a community of policymakers and leaders and practitioners and researchers, and we're all focusing on learning acceleration in states, districts, and schools. But we know there's a lot that surrounds learning acceleration, including student well-being, educator well-being, staffing in schools, and supports. And so you'll start to see that the types of resources we have really address those. Further, we're going to be sharing emerging research findings on learning acceleration and our pandemic efforts and pandemic recovery efforts. And then finally, we're hoping to create some opportunities to learn from actual experiences and perspectives of practitioners and policymakers. So it's a very exciting session. We're really looking forward to it. I will say one thing that we're starting to shift towards is that now that the sense of urgency and emergency that was brought about by the pandemic, while we're still dealing and grappling with challenges in the education systems, we know that we have a more regulated and consistent effort moving forward. And we understand that the importance of this work not only will support the field right now, but we're learning how to prepare for future disruptions. And I'm sure in all of our minds, things like the hurricanes most recently in Florida that are upsetting, and in Tennessee that are upsetting kind of the public education system as we know it. And we're hoping that what we can learn from this pandemic will help to support students moving forward. So things like natural disasters, unplanned school closures due to violence or other incidences, and also, I hate to say it, but potentially future pandemics. So what do we know about, what have we learned from our experience, and how can we let this experience inform our future work? Next slide, please. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Elaine Allensworth, who is the Executive Director of the Chicago Consortium for School Research. She is the head and leading with the Chicago Public Schools, one of our RPP core research teams. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elaine.
Thank you, Susan. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from Chicago. I'm Elaine Allensworth. I'm at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, and I'm just one member of a much larger team. I'm going to be talking to you about the Skyline initiative. Actually, can you go back to the slide before my face? Yeah, thank you. So in Chicago, one of the major strategies developed for supporting learning recovery was to invest in high quality curricular resources along with professional development to use those resources. And they called that initiative Skyline. So I'm going to be talking about some of the lessons learned as they implemented the supports in the early grades around literacy. You can go forward 2 slides. Thanks. So Skyline was seen as the district's response to multiple forms of upheaval that were going on. There were the disruptions in student learning with the pandemic. There was also a transformation. There is a transformation happening in literacy instruction from balanced literacy to the science of reading. There's also an equity imperative, and the district saw gaps in access to high quality instructional materials as opportunity gaps that they had to address. So they felt there was this imperative to really dramatically change instructional practices and improve rates of student learning, especially for student groups most affected by the pandemic. So together with publishers, they developed a digitally delivered standards-based curriculum with high quality resources that teachers could access online, with culturally responsive texts, with real physical paper books that people could use, with aligned formative and summative assessments, with lesson plans and modifications to the lesson plans. They did this in all grades and all subjects simultaneously. So our study just focuses on K-2 literacy. but there are implications for the broader initiative. So this was very ambitious. It was, ambitious in terms of the scale and the speed of the launch of this initiative. And the district recognized this, that there were going to be things that needed to change, right? That it was not going to be perfect. And so they actually embedded continuous improvement into their contracts with vendors and partners. And they also planned for continuous improvement by, reaching out to researchers to, provide input as they were rolling this out. So continuous improvement was really an integral part of this. And the idea is that you can have it online so you can make these continual changes. It was also ambitious because, any kind of initiative that involves technology is going to have demands in terms of the technical infrastructure and also in terms of the digital literacy that is needed for the users. So next slide, I'm going to talk about lessons learned in terms, first of all, lessons learned in terms of, rolling out curriculum as this dynamic product, this digital curriculum. And it seems very likely that digital resources are going to become more prevalent in this new, the new world going forward. And there are a lot of advantages to curriculum as this dynamic product. You can roll out, and the district was able to roll out the curriculum, and all these materials to all schools at once. Any modifications, new things that are added can immediately be accessed by anybody. And teachers, definitely saw this as a huge improvement, especially if they were in schools that did not already have access to high quality resources. And it brings coherence across classes, across grade bands. We especially saw improvement in schools that were teaching Spanish language arts, where they often did not have materials before that. A third of the district in Chicago starts as multilingual learners whose home language is Spanish. And we found that the more that materials are similar across English language arts and Spanish language arts, the easier it was for teachers, teachers teaching in bilingual classes or mixed classes, or as students transition into English language arts classes. The cultural representation in the text was a really important selling point to schools, and it's been really well received both by students and by teachers. And of course, the digital delivery, facilitates continuous improvement in real time. But just because it can be improved doesn't mean that the resources can go out unpolished. And so that gets into a lot of the limitations with the digital curriculum. First of all, any initiative that involves technology is going to have technical issues, and any new curricular resources really need to be tried out and vetted. And so, of course, there were technology issues, and there was a steep learning curve for teachers to use the materials, with both because of the technology and also because there's so many materials, it could just be overwhelming. The district thought, has designed this for teachers to do subtractive planning. So they have lots of materials, and then teachers can use those aspects that make sense in their context. But that takes a lot of effort to figure out how to do that. And so one thing you really need to keep in mind is that the materials really need to be easy to use in order to actually be used and to be useful for improving instruction, right? So it makes teachers' jobs easier. It makes it easier to deliver high quality instruction instead of making it harder. And so in this case, it was difficult to integrate some of the slides with Google Classroom or to edit the slides. And so those kinds of things made it more difficult for teachers. And then unlike paper resources, because the resources change, that also can put demands on teachers. For example, you could, implement a lesson one year, the next year you go to implement it, and now the resources have changed. And teachers need to be able to plan for the arc of instruction. And so even though maybe you could, roll out units, at later points in the year, if teachers can't see what's coming and have all that, the materials available for planning out their instruction for the course of the year, that's going to make it a lot harder for them. And it also means that any changes in resources really need to be tweaks rather than changes in that big arc of instruction. It also means that teacher support is really important. And this is true for any new curriculum. Just having resources is not enough to improve instruction. You really need support for teachers to use those resources. So that gets into the next lessons learned on the next slide. So we're in this environment now where we're getting used to accessing resources online, participating in Zoom professional learning events like this one. So it might make sense that you would host most professional learning online. In the case of this big curriculum rollout, the urgency of getting information out broadly, quickly, led to a focus on online resources and online professional learning. And there are definitely advantages to that. You can, access, everyone can access it. You have more control over messaging. So, you can go to scale quickly. You can have fewer trainers that can be located anywhere. You don't have to get people to the right places. Logistically, it's a lot easier. But what we saw was that there were low rates of participation in the online learning, certainly not enough to be able to really use the resources broadly. There's more participation in the summer sessions, but very low participation in the school year as teachers were actually trying to implement the curriculum. So teachers weren't getting the help they needed when they needed it. Everyone's having difficulty getting substitute teachers. It was hard to find time, but also, different users had different needs. So, there were these sessions designed where teachers would come together from different schools around the same lesson and help each other with lesson planning. But people came there with different familiarity with the technology, with the curriculum, so it made it very difficult for those sessions to be productive for teachers. Instead, what teachers have really found helpful is school-embedded professional learning and collaboration with other teachers so that teachers are getting help as they do their work, focused on their needs. And so the district has, kind of shifted strategies to really be more about, leveraging local knowledge, leveraging collaboration. So, going to professional learning communities, instructional coaches, network instructional support, so that, teachers have that support right there in their school. We've also found that, where there were teams at schools helping each other to use the sports or coaches helping teachers using the curriculum, in those schools, teachers were actually better able to make use of the centrally offered online professional learning because they had that support there at the school, and they also had more buy-in, right? And then we've also found that communication is just vitally important in rolling out these big initiatives. This was an initiative intended to support teachers, to make their jobs easier. And yet, of course, when teachers started using it, they really struggled. It was something very new and, they had difficulties. And so then you have teachers, posting things online about how difficult it is. And the union came out with some messages that were critical about Skyline. So then, teachers, no one wanted to be the face of Skyline, to be the advocate or the exemplar. So that communication is really important. And also when you're continually changing resources and improving things, you want to make sure people know that, know what those changes are. There has been a lot of growth in the use of Skyline. So, but, I think it started with 100 schools using the early literacy materials in the first year, and now it's something like over 300 schools. So it has expanded, but it really was an uphill battle. So in terms of recommendations, just we can go to the next slide, thanks. Providing high quality resources for teachers has the potential to improve practice and further equity. We definitely see teachers appreciating the new resources and supports. And embedding continuous improvement in the resources and professional learning has really good long-term potential for eventually having resources that are really easy to use and, where there's enough capacity to really use them effectively. But even if you have, continuous improvement embedded in, it would be good to start small if you can, so that you can work out those kinks. But you often can't do that for political or economic reasons, which was the case here. So a lot of times, even if you want to start small, you end up starting big. So continuous improvement is a great thing to have. But even if you can do that and have continuous improvement embedded, you really want to have those materials to be easy to use, adaptable by teachers, and teachers really need that local collaborative professional learning, which means you need to have time, and routines and structures figured out so that, teachers have that help, they can get that help when they need it. They have that ability to collaborate, and they can really make good use of those resources, whether local or centralized. And then that two-way communication is really important for building capacity and buy-in with district implementers, hearing from teachers about how it's going for them, what their experiences are, and then with teachers hearing from district folks about their intentions and where things are going and what's changed. So that's it. Next slide. Our future research. We're going to be examining changes in student outcomes, looking at teachers' use of Skyline materials and their participation in the professional learning, especially looking at differences for students in particular priority groups, and looking at the effects of school context. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, I think we have time for about one question. So a question that we have, let me see, make sure I get camera turned on. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the presentation. So question for you, did the district use train the trainer model or something similar for the professional learning? And if so, did this help address some of that tension between the locally and centrally provided professional learning?
Yeah, no, they did not. They didn't feel they had enough capacity to, first of all, and it actually, when we look at this, so they did not do that model, but it does contrast with another initiative that was really successful in Chicago, which was the implementation of Common Core, the Common Core mathematics standards, where they selected, they had each school select 2 teachers to become teacher leaders in Common Core implementation. And then those teacher leaders became part of a professional community that would get together. And then those teacher teams, having those 2 teachers in schools, would work together to support each other around changing instructional practices, and then they would work to support change in the school. That ended up being very effective for changing instructional practices in Chicago, and we saw significant improvements in the quality of instruction, especially for students with the lowest tested skills, and then improvements in students' test gains, again, especially for students with the lowest tested skills, who are the least likely to have the highest quality instruction before that. So I think that there's, and they wouldn't call that train the trainer. They would, they would say they developed teacher leaders who work together, and that was a really effective mechanism. Which was not done this time because, they were trying to do this very fast. They had a lot of information to get out, and they just didn't have the capacity to be able to do that kind of model here at first.
Makes sense. Thank you so much. I think we are switching over now to our next presenters.
Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you to the incredible work that's happened in Chicago. Elaine, very impressive. Looking forward to seeing the further research that is conducted there. Thank you to Restart and everyone who's been invited, everybody who's tuned in. Here we are, Denver Public Schools, representing proudly the Council of Great City Schools. I'm accompanied by Dr. Simone Wright, who's our Chief of Academics, and I am the proud superintendent of this incredible district. We are going to really tell a bit of a story on how we engage. We're both fairly newer, if you will, to this incredible city. But we came in as many others during the height towards the height end of the pandemic. Going to the next slide, you'll see something that's anchored in how we engage each and every day. It is our what defines the DPS being Denver Public Schools experience. So that obviously constitutes what you see before you, the student experience at the core, the adult experience, which is often neglected in strategic plans. And of course, the system experience, everything that happens to ensure that our students have the opportunity to succeed. All those three little circles define the DPS experience. When I first arrived here, again, right towards the end of the pandemic, when students were coming back in person, we were still wearing masks for the most part. I engaged in a robust listening and learning tour. But this is not just your regular listening and learning tour. I made it a point to really go deep into our community and really get from those who have been historically marginalized and even those who felt invisible to society. I made it a point to make sure I captured not only the loudest voices, but of course, those who have been historically marginalized. I heard their needs, their hopes, their dreams, and the role that they feel the district needs to lead, right, to make those come to a reality. And that learning I did alongside the community informed a very thorough process, but ultimately it led to what you see before you, which is a strategic roadmap, which is the foundation of the DPS experience that I mentioned not too long ago. That roadmap is grounded in the perspective of our community. And I say it's a cheat code, right? So no one should be the owner. Dr. Wright is not the owner. Respectfully, our board is not the owner. I'm not the owner. All I did was put things together, the needs, wants, and desires of the community, regurgitated back. The community is the owner of this roadmap. Beginning with our students, our adults, our system experience to catalyze the district's growth. I heard repeatedly throughout my journey upon arrival the need to support our communities with wraparound supports. Obviously, we were coming from the pandemic, so that was top of mind, but also investing in our schools as a hub. Instead of it just being the place that we send our lovely kids, our loved ones to, and then we see them coming back, it needed to be way more than that, is what I was capturing as I was engaging with folks, right? And that happens to connect very deeply with what I believe in. So it's like a perfect marriage. It's like, maybe you could say I really was yearning to hear it, but it was so repeated that even if I wanted to ignore it, I could not. In a moment, Dr. Wright is going to speak to the academic and the learning priorities that evolve from this roadmap. But I want to speak to the cornerstone of the roadmap, and it's in bold there. It's our community hubs, hearing what I heard and also coming up with how to maximize space, but also to just eradicate the obstacles that exist outside of the school building. So bell to bell, we're masters at what we do. Everyone on this call, those who are listening, you know how to engage and just remove the obstacles that exist bell to bell. But we're going through this cyclical cycle in terms of where we go back. I'm thinking of my story. No, school was a safe haven, but it was an absolute blur and it was dangerous and treacherous outside of school, right? So how can I address that was what I was trying to do with this community hubs concept. And they truly serve as a conduit of re-engaging and supporting families, integrating them into our system. The hubs have uplifted families, providing access and tools so that families can be their best selves at home, as opposed to another burden that comes with being a parent or just engaging with society. So it first was to remove those barriers. You don't know what we're going to eat tonight? No, go to the hub and we'll figure it out. Turning into a learning experience instead of just the ingredients. Here is a true bodega experience, but also here's the recipe. So now you and your child can bond. Then it evolved from just basic needs like food and clothing markets, workforce development, a pipeline directly to DPS, basic needs, financial assistance, social, emotional, mental health supports. Then it evolved into GED and ESL classes, and we welcomed well over 4,000 new to country students this past year. This was the absolute foundation and also a life span for these individuals. Without these community hubs as something that not only was available, I don't know how they would have really been embraced by the city of Denver. So not only were they provided an opportunity to be productive members of our local society, they evolved to GED graduates, citizenship, early literacy classes were also offered, technology and computer support, parenting, and even financial literacy classes. So truly a beacon on how we were able to not only recover from the pandemic, but also the unexpected and well-welcomed new to country arrivals. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Wright to speak to some of those aforementioned academic learning priorities that evolved from the roadmap, but I wanted to anchor everything that happened outside of the school building, and it's still to this day a foundational component of our scholarly lives, our parents, and even those who do not have students in our system are benefiting from these programs. I also put into the chat some links that you can see and follow after this, what the community hubs offer. Dr. Wright.
Thank you, Dr. Morrell. So next slide. One of the core ideas that also came out of our strategic roadmap is around accelerated trajectories. More explicitly, advancing the achievement and closing the disparities for our historically underserved and underestimated students. This led DPS to define the focus areas regarding the learning experience to be focused on grade level text and tasks and safe and welcoming. The research tells us that the more time with grade level content that is standards aligned, but also provides opportunities for students to pursue their interest, framed as pursuits of passion in the roadmap, are key drivers to students achieving. Similar to many districts, we offered a robust summer experience across grades K-5. We utilized numerous partners to support us with implementing high-impact tutoring. But I want to highlight the work we were able to do with Saturday School, providing 25 additional instructional days that were centrally funded. While this created opportunities for students to have more time engaging with grade level content with the appropriate scaffolds and supports, we also offered varied opportunities to cultivate student interests and passions. I would also offer that the revamp of Saturday School for the past few school years have really gotten leaders to buy into this additional day of school. A number of leaders right now are choosing to fund Saturday School on their own. Next slide. Interconnected to the expectations outlined in our strategic roadmap, specifically accelerated trajectories, and again, those anchors safe and welcoming grade level text and tasks, implied was a necessity to refine or define how we approach Tier 1 instruction. Refinement required us to continue to engage educators, students, community members, including families, to understand their aspirations for the daily learning experience within our classrooms and understand what effective instructional practices were contributing to achievement across DPS already. The input of our educators, students, and other stakeholders affirm the priority to increase the quality of instruction for our students. To better support higher quality teaching and learning, we released our instructional framework this past spring, which clearly articulates our instructional vision and provides guidance to support educators across the system. The instructional core, as you can see in the middle of the diagram on the right, serves as the evidence base for the framework, elevating the need to ensure we place interesting and challenging content in front of our learners and ensuring teachers are well trained to ensure high levels of student engagement every single day. We identified 3 key drivers that are essential for achieving our standard of excellence for teaching and learning and operationalizing the instructional core, which is the graphic to the right. The intersection of content, teacher knowledge and skill, and student engagement is another way for us to think through our own continuous improvement cycle, grounded in effective teaching and learning. And none of this can be achieved without a strong culture and climate, which is why you see safe and welcoming as the outer circle. Interconnected to the engagement with our educators, we heard a strong desire for curricular coherence to strengthen the student experience. By focusing on high-quality instructional materials, we are positioned to promote vertical and horizontal coherence across the district and scale highly effective pedagogical approaches that will ensure consistently high-quality learning experiences for all students. When we pair that with assessment, we ensure teachers are able to have a consistent and precise gauge of each student's individual progress in their knowledge and skill development, ensuring that each individual learner receives instruction that centers their assets and advances achievement. We have to continue to engage in professional learning, ensuring continuous knowledge and skill building in service of meeting each individual student's need. It is worth naming that we have some great synergy in Denver Public Schools to advance the quality of instruction within our system.
Thank you so much. We have time for one question. So let me read it. One of the things that we've observed is that it is difficult to get students to participate in additional time or extra learning. And additionally, the students who may benefit the most are sometimes the least likely to be able to attend. I'm wondering whether this is an issue for Saturday school and whether you have strategies for increasing engagement and targeting students in need. It's a long question, so.
Yeah, no, I'll start, Dr. Ryan, if you want to add anything. Yeah, that goes back to trying to, if I can, just simplify by saying leveling the playing field, right? In terms of the realities of what exists, and we see it happening. When we opened up our after school, it is an absolute fury, and in a matter of moments, I have my children. I was just a couple minutes late and they were out, meaning it's who has the savviness, also the skills, or really the access. So it's not as if we were board admission. We offered that, but then we extended those opportunities. So outside of the summer engagements, in case of a long break, and we opened up our schools, and those obstacles that exist is usually related to transportation. So we made it a point that before we even offer, that we have that there, and it's part of the presentation as well. So it's less about trying to remove access to some, because not only is that controversial, it's also wrong, but how can we get those that are often just either forgotten or they're just unaware or unable to navigate the complex systems that we put before them. And the community hubs also offer that as well, because now what that has alleviated a lot of the burden of being a parent, right? So now folks can be redirected in a very professional way. Say, okay, you don't have to worry about XYZ. Are you aware that in a couple of days we're going to open up our portal for Summer Academy, and here's how you can engage. So it's been a struggle, but we're attempting to address it in the most sophisticated but also inclusive way.
Thank you so much. It looks like we're moving on to our next presenter. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So this is Dr. Jonathan Eisler from the California Department of Education. I'm very excited to be here representing our larger team that includes AIR, UC San Diego, UC Berkeley, and the California Department of Education. Along with myself, I have Julian Betts from UC San Diego, who will be presenting this morning about the California Learning Recovery Project. Next slide, please. I think we can go to the following slide. So in terms of the context of California, California, obviously, the largest state in the nation in terms of population. We have the largest student population as well, with almost 6 million students in our K-12 public schools. Very diverse student population, both racially, ethnically, as well as in terms of socioeconomics. We have basically a lot of disruptions due to the pandemic, as you can imagine, just like every other state. So our math proficiency, for instance, on our standardized assessments dropped over 6 percentage points during the pandemic. And not surprisingly, and I'm sure this is the case with many other states, we had many more setbacks amongst our most at-risk student populations: ethnic diversity, homeless students, multilingual learners, et cetera. To the map to the right, just to give you a little bit more context about something we're going to talk about a little bit later, we actually are conducting case studies in 9 of our districts throughout the state. And this map here shows not only the kind of diversity in terms of size of district that we've been able to qualitatively understand what's going on at these districts, but also just diversity in terms of geography and, you know, rural versus urban versus suburban districts throughout the state. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot. We call this our bubble chart, where it kind of explains different funding sources, both federal and state, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see starting in early 2020, we got some funding, and then of course, more funding over time. There's the massive ESSER 3 funding that came into play in 2021. Again, like many other states, a lot of this funding was extremely helpful, and we'll talk a little bit more about where some of that funding went in a moment here. But also, like most other states, I would imagine, there is this kind of fiscal cliff that's been kind of hanging over the state of California, which, although some of the funding goes out to 27, 28, most of that cliff, quote unquote, hit this year or even last year in some cases. So even though we've had over $60 billion of combined federal and state recovery funding, a lot of that funding has essentially been completed in the state. Next slide. So we have kind of 3 research strands on the California team. One is just, first of all, mapping what are the actual learning recovery interventions that California districts are implementing throughout the state to support recovery. So we have a lot of information from district plans that are actually published online or in public in other ways. We're doing more quantitative analyses of the relationship between district programs and student outcomes. So Julian and his team at UC San Diego are doing some analyses of state longitudinal data system, which in California is CalPADS, as well as assessments data, which Julian will talk about. And then also, what are the things that the districts are using to be able to make budgetary and programmatic decisions? So towards the end of the presentation, I'll mention a couple of the different strategies, as well as you can see from the map earlier, we have this longitudinal case studies of these 9 districts throughout the state. Next slide. So in terms of the recovery itself, we actually have a sample of over 700 districts in the state from the prior school year, the 2022-23 school year. And there's 3 kind of major buckets or categories that we've kind of been able to code from culling through all of these plans. The first is just extending learning time for students, right? So almost 80% of districts reported expanding or opening up summer programs. 2/3 of them extended the school day, and then also over half added tutoring with qualified staff. The second kind of bucket that we recognized was just staffing issues. So we have over half essentially hiring teachers for instructional supports or doing staff training with academic focus or socio-emotional learning focus. And then the final kind of set of supports is more kind of adding new instructional materials or using increased technology in teaching. Not surprisingly, in the very beginning time of the pandemic, tech, including increasing Wi-Fi and making sure that all students had access to devices where they could get to virtual learning, of course, exploded. And then that's kind of tapered off over time as more and more students have had access. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're learning about the relationship between district's choice of support programs and student outcomes. The slides I'm going to be presenting are going to be focusing on what we've learned in our most recent research, comparing the school years 21-22 to 22-23. In a way, that's cleaner because we're largely post-pandemic by those years, and we can look at impacts of spending and so on without the contamination of kids being homesick to a great degree. Just in a sense or two, though, I will tell you that when we analyzed test scores between 2019 and 2022, we found the same pattern you've seen nationwide, large losses in test scores, especially in math and in lower grades. And we also found increasing inequality in performance across schools, which seems to be related to socioeconomic status. We found that federal COVID spending per pupil and opening schools earlier were two policy levers that actually were statistically significant and helpful. But the problem is the strength of those levers was quite small compared to the sort of tsunami of test score loss. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to be showing you what we've learned about learning recovery between spring 22 and spring 23. This histogram is showing a distribution of school districts across the state in terms of how much recovery there was in math scale score points. So if you see that tiny little vertical red line, that's the average change, and it's a 2.62 scale score point gain, which is roughly 1/8 of a year of learning. So on average, there was progress. You do see, though, that from the histogram that there's a huge distribution here. Roughly 1 out of 5 school districts actually experienced test score decline in math. We've seen some recovery in percent of days absent, and on average, there actually was a slight decline in 23 in English language arts scores in California. But just like for this graph I'm showing you for math, for percent of days absent and for English language arts scores, huge distribution. Some districts with great gains, others with losses. Next slide, please. So here I'm showing results of regression analysis where we're trying to explain the extent of recovery in these three outcomes, days absent and math and English language arts scores in 23 relative to 22. And this is after taking into account changes in student characteristics between the 2 years. So the points are showing the mean effects, and the bars are showing the confidence intervals. There were no significant effects here of federal COVID spending per pupil, which is not what we found for federal COVID spending per pupil between 2019 and 2022, although at least you do see that, although insignificant in a statistical sense, there are positive effects on math and ELA. Next slide, please. Then we turn to this really rich set of data that Nugao at AIR and colleagues have gained, first through reading the detailed plans for intervention for this 22 to 23 school year. These are written plans that districts are required by the state to file that explains how they're going to spend money on the ELOG Expanded Learning Opportunities grants. And second, New and team also conducted a district survey during the 22 to 23 school year on what interventions were actually underway. We've just dipped, these are very rich data sets. We've just dipped into the surface of these data sets so far. For test scores, we're not finding a significant impact of specific programs on test scores. And I should say here what I mean by this is we're using 5 or 6 aggregate measures of things like, do you have extended day learning programs or acceleration programs and so on. We do find some effects, though, on percent of days absent. Extending instructional time, as reported by districts, is linked to a 0.9 percentage point reduction in days absent. And districts that reported teacher retention programs to try to ensure greater stability of the teaching labor force inside the district, that's also linked to a slightly higher effect, a 1.5 percentage point reduction. So we'll have more to report, I think, in a couple of months. We're finding some things that are working, at least for percent days absent, during this more recent period right now. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Julian. So in terms of districts themselves, what they're responding to and what they're kind of dealing with in terms of the budget, thinking back to that bubble slide several slides ago, prior to the pandemic, for the last 10 years or so, California has had what we call the local control funding formula, which really focuses funding on most disadvantaged groups of students. But prior to that, there were all these categorical kind of funding buckets. And really that's kind of what districts are facing now, is this almost kind of a return to the categorical category. So there's been some challenges involved with kind of making those shifts in terms of district planning. There's other challenges, of course, they're facing: labor shortages, teacher turnover, union pressures. I think this is, again, not unique to California. Many other states are having this, as well as kind of uneven civic cohesion. So the responses by districts have been different types of responses. Of course, many of them are using the one-time dollars to stabilize their own fiscal health. And some of them are also adding new programs or expanding programs that help kind of school organization. So those are two very common reactions. And then also, again, this focus on social emotional well-being, getting back to that chart showing the different staffing supports. That's another response that we found districts have been very commonly utilizing to kind of support social emotional well-being. And what's interesting, and this is something that came up during the Restart Network meeting earlier this year, not only for students themselves, which of course is our number one priority, but also socio-emotional well-being of staff, adults, administrators, teachers, et cetera. Next slide. And then in terms of innovations, we really have found some really amazing and innovative practices coming out of these districts, and a wide range of them. So again, structural reforms focusing very much on socio-emotional learning. Also, what are the things that we can do to better engage students? So digital tools, using kind of hybrid in-person and virtual tools to be able to engage different student groups. Adding more adults to the classrooms in some cases is being very effective. We're hearing from certain districts. So those are all kind of structural reforms. And we're also encountering organizational and pedagogical innovations. So adding another period so students can take more electives. I think we've heard from partnered states that being able to engage students, a lot of it hinges around offering more electives, increasing small group time to kind of focus on specific skill sets. And then again, socio-emotional kind of focus, wellness centers on campus, and Saturday Academy. So again, this is similar to some of the other things that we've already heard or we'll hear from other groups, but just a very holistic kind of approach, both organizational and pedagogically. And that is our last slide.
Thank you so much for sharing about all of your work. We got in a question for both presenters. So how has this research, particularly what Dr. Betts pointed out with academic recovery about improvement across a wide distribution across districts, supported or informed state strategy for supporting recovery?
I think I'll also ask Jonathan to answer that. I think we're at the stage where districts they're very scared of the fiscal cliff, and they've been braiding together funds from one source and another to keep programs that they think have been really important to recovery alive. We're now at a point where a lot of districts, unfortunately, are going to have to be paring back some of those efforts. So our hope is that some of our results, for instance, the results we just highlighted on factors that seem to be linked to declines in percent of days absent, that might give some hints to districts about which things to really protect as belts get tightened, and which things maybe can be cut back.
And I would just very quickly add one quick comment, which is our research team has been providing regular debriefs to the California Department of Education leadership, as well as debriefing the California State Legislature and Governor's Office. So kind of sharing best practices for those who actually make the decisions about funding. So those are, to build on what Julian said, those are kind of more practical ways that the information is getting disseminated and shared with leadership in the state.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. And we are now shifting to our next presenter.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elise Dizon-Ross. I'm a researcher at CALDER at AIR. CALDER stands for the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research. And I'm going to be presenting some results from the Road to Recovery project, specifically looking at interventions from ESSER Year 3, so from 2022 to 23 school year. Next slide, please. And next slide again. There, that's just me. So the Road to Recovery project is a research practice partnership is between CALDER, NWA, and Harvard University, and most importantly, a coalition of districts from around the country. So throughout the course of the project, the number of districts has shifted a little bit, anywhere between 8 and 12. For the research that I'm going to be talking about today, we worked with 9 amazing districts. So Dallas, Guilford County Schools, Santa Ana, Portland, Tulsa, Richardson, Alexandria, Suffern, and Syracuse City. So we had an awesome group of people to work with, representing really diverse student bodies from around the country. Overall, the districts in our coalition have a higher percentage of free and reduced price eligible students and students of color than the national average. And as you can tell, just kind of by looking at it, they represent a really diverse set of circumstances and also geographically all around the country. So the project has been in place for about 3 years. In previous work, we've examined recovery interventions from 21-22 and summer 22. Like I said, I'm just going to be talking about 22-23 for this very short presentation. But in that school year, we analyzed several different types of interventions. And the whole idea of this was just to try to understand what is the effect of these recovery interventions on students in these districts, focusing on academic measures. So we looked at tutoring, small group interventions, out of school time programs, extended years, and expert teachers. As you can imagine, there was a lot of variety in how these programs were implemented. For any given one of those bullets, I'm sure everyone on this call knows there's dozens of different ways that you could implement that program. So we had interviews with each of the districts to really try to understand both the program design and then also the program implementation, because we all know a lot of times the design does not equal the implementation when you have to set up these programs, particularly at scale. By and large, all those types of programs that we looked at are aimed at increasing the amount of instructional time for students. The one exception there is expert teachers, which you might notice is a little bit of a different flavor of intervention. And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about sort of expert teachers separately. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to be talking through the effects that we found of tutoring and small group instruction. I will say that for extended year and out of school time programs, the takeaways were pretty much the same. And I'll walk through what's in these graphs, but just to give you guys the main takeaway is that most tutoring and small group instructional programs did not positively impact student test scores. And we used NWA MAP growth scores as sort of our outcome measure here. That said, there is some interesting nuance, so I want to go through it. So just so you can orient yourself to these graphs, on the left, we have math interventions. On the right, we have reading. We do anonymize the districts here. So there were 5 districts that implemented at least one type of math tutoring or small group program. And there were 6 districts that had at least one type of reading small group or math program. The gray dots are our point estimates, and the little blue bars are the confidence intervals. And at the top, we have the overall. So that's just sort of summarizing all the district programs beneath it. And you can see that by and large, we are not seeing statistically significant effects, particularly on the positive side. For all of these estimates, the way we estimate it was using value-added models. So what we're doing is we're really comparing outcomes for observably similar students who did or did not participate in the program. Now, there are, you might notice, a few exceptions to this somewhat bleak picture. Thank you. And that would be a math tutoring and 2 reading tutoring interventions. And there are some things that really stand out about these. So overall, the average dosage, the overall amount of time students spent in these programs really range. So across all the districts, the average dosage was between 6 and 50 hours over the course of the year. Huge range. The participation rates also had a huge range. They were between 1% and 20% of students in eligible grades. So you see where we do find positive effects, these really stand out for their high dosage numbers and their low participation rates. And that's something that we thought was really notable. A lot of times these programs, one of the biggest challenges of them is scaling them up. And we see here sort of where districts have had success is where they actually kept things small and really focused on getting a lot of treatment to a smaller number of kids. Just so you know, the green diamonds in this graph shows what we would expect the effect of these programs to be if they had the same impact per hour as what research tells us about high dosage tutoring. So you'll see for these, it's actually quite similar, with one exception. The green diamond is quite a bit more than the gray dot, but it's kind of in the range of what you would expect from a high quality, high dosage tutoring program. And the difference really there is that they're able to provide that type of service to a smaller number of kids. Next slide. Okay, I just wanted to mention the expert teachers program because it is a little bit different from the others. So in one district, the struggling students were assigned to expert teachers, who are teachers with high evaluation scores, who are already employed by the district. So that's important. They weren't newly hired. Really what you had here was a shuffling of kids to the teachers based on their need. So sort of necessarily, kids who were not deemed high need did not have expert teachers. And that's sort of something to keep in mind when we think about the comparison. Again, unlike the other interventions, this program did not provide students with additional instructional time. It's just which teacher you had for your classroom. And here we did find positive effects for, again, students compared to observably similar students who did not have expert teachers. Both math and reading, we found positive effects. And if you could go one slide forward, yeah. So something to note here is that this is different from the other programs in that actually the participation rate, the number of students treated, was much higher. So we had 32% of students were treated with expert teachers in math, 20% of students were treated with expert teachers in ELA. So this kind of goes against the rule that I talked about a second ago with the programs. And again, it's a totally different type of program, but sort of, this is one district's kind of creative way of trying to really serve the needs of students who have been hurt by the pandemic. Next slide. So just to summarize our takeaways, scale matters for impact, but there may be some exceptions. So again, overall, we did not find measurably positive impacts of these programs on students, which is obviously a bit of a bummer, but it is really interesting to note that programs with high dosage and a small number of targeted recipients did seem to have some real benefits for students. So these findings suggest that there's really a trade-off here between scale and impact when it comes to academic recovery. And that was very important for districts to wrestle with, obviously, when there was a lot of funding, when ESSER was still widely available. Now that those dollars are going away, it becomes even more important and relevant for districts to wrestle with. And again, one district's expert teachers program provides a promising and different type of approach to improving outcomes for struggling students. Next slide. And I will just briefly say that this work is still ongoing. So we are currently wrapping up our analysis of summer 2023 interventions, and then also looking at several years of interventions, their impact on non-test outcomes. So looking at attendance, discipline, and course grades. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll be able to share those results with you all soon.
Thank you so much. We have time for one question. So how did your team share these findings back with the district, or how do you plan to share them back with the districts? And if you did have a chance to share them, how did they help kind of shape their planning or thinking around some of these interventions?
Yeah, great question. So for each district, we create sort of a PowerPoint report that we try to make very user-friendly and accessible. And we meet with each district and sort of walk through the report with them to share what we've learned about participation and dosage and impact estimates. And we really try to make it a conversation so that our context at the district, which normally involves folks from the research evaluation team, and then also directors of tutoring or director of summer school, whichever we're looking at, can react and sort of help explain things we find, or sort of like have a discussion amongst themselves. It really varies across districts how they use this information. Some are surprised, some totally are like, yes, that's what we expected to see. But a lot of times it helps them kind of zero in on the implementation challenges, which they have a sense of, but don't have data to back up, so that they can inform how they want to shift the sort of design and implementation of their programs for the next year. But again, like it really does vary across districts, but we try to make it as sort of usable for them as possible.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. And it looks like we're transitioning to our school leaders panel now.
Great, thank you so much. I'm Greg Waples with the National Association of Secondary School Principals. We are very proud partners of the Restart Network and happy to be on with you this afternoon. We've heard a lot in the presentation so far from the high-level researchers and district-level officials talking about some of the post-pandemic shifts in K-12 education. And now we're going to drill down a little bit further for some perspective from building leaders and what's actually happening from the perspective of folks who are in the school every single day working with teachers and students on the ground. So we have a couple of excellent principals affiliated with NASSP on with us this afternoon. We have Dr. Michael Rubin, who is the principal of Uxbridge High School in Massachusetts. Welcome, Dr. Rubin. And we have Dr. Terry Daniels, who is the principal of Folsom Middle School in California. Welcome, Dr. Daniels. And moderating this conversation this afternoon will be our friend coming back to us once again, Dr. Susan Theriault. So I will now turn it over to Susan to start the conversation.
Thanks so much, Greg. And I also need to say that Greg is also an advisory board member, a valued advisory board member for the Restart Network, and really critical to making sure school leaders are represented in the conversations we're having at the network. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Rubin and Dr. Daniels. I'm really, really excited to be chatting with you today. So I just want to start off with one of the things that my team, the Restart Network team, has been noticing. There's just a fatigue surrounding the notion of pandemic recovery, and we see it coinciding with the decrease, not surprisingly, the sunsetting of federal funding, or the fiscal cliff, as many people are referring to it as, and the ability to kind of fund those recovery-specific interventions. But we also know, and from the research that we've just seen, that there are still challenges our students are facing and schools continue to face in terms of both academic, social, emotional, and well-being of students and staff. And we're also seeing real concerns about retaining educators and hiring new educators. And in light of what Elise just presented with regard to this expert educator model, that's a real challenge, and also a seemingly successful intervention. We're also seeing chronic absenteeism at new heights and real differences across schools and districts. So it sounds gloomy, what I'm starting to say, but I'm not trying to say that. We're really interested in kind of how you're thinking about this work and your work right now. We're out of the emergency set and we're into our day-to-day. I know it's still not routine, but it's more routine than it has been over the past 3 years. So I'm wondering if both of you could chime in on just this bigger question, and whether you can share with our audience your perspective on this post-COVID context and in your school, and what the next 5 years looks like for you. Have you seen positive changes? What are your biggest challenges? I'm sure you have lots to say in this space. So I don't know if Dr. Rubin or Dr. Daniels, who would like to go first, but I would love to hear from both of you.
I can start off, and I am working in a middle school. So I think right now it's really interesting to have this question at this point. I come from a big family of educators, extended, and we were together this weekend, and it was interesting to me talking to a few of my family members who actually are in the high school setting, and that they said that actually this year they're feeling like things are getting back to pre-COVID times as far as how they're feeling like the kids are starting to settle in and not seeing as much of the effects as they've seen in the past few years. So that was interesting to me. I will say in my experience right now, what we're seeing in the middle school is when we first came back, there were more behavioral issues that we were dealing with, I think from the kids being home and not being able to interact. Now in our middle school, we're seeing more, oh my goodness, sorry about that. We're seeing more of the academic gaps coming in, which to me makes a lot of sense because the kids that we're getting now in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade were actually at those critical periods when we were in COVID as far as being in 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade. And so with those critical foundational skills at that time, now we're seeing the gaps coming in that they're missing those skills. I think social and emotionally, we're seeing still some developmental delays in our kiddos. They're dealing more with things that we may have originally seen when they were younger. And so we're still seeing some of those delayed behaviors in our students from having that lack of interaction, social interaction with their peers back at that time. So those are the things in middle school that we're seeing mostly right now. Some of the social emotional, I don't know that we can just say it's post-COVID or due to COVID. I think we're seeing a lot of the anxiety, et cetera, building up. And I think some of that is more due to social media, and that's a whole nother topic. But I do see that that is a key piece that we need to look at in education as we move forward, the anxiety and the different effects. And I know we talk a lot about that at NASSP too, on how we can bring this and shed some light on it as we're advocating with policymakers. So I'll turn it over to Mike for the high school.
Yeah, I think you'll hear some of the same, and I'll avoid any just mere redundancy and say that I do think there's a sort of more normal feel around the day-to-day. I think that has come from at least the group that we now see in the high school. There's a more sincere appreciation for the concept of being present, which sounds counterintuitive when we compare it to the national phenomenon or the national epidemic of chronic absenteeism. Those two things are really running sort of side by each for us. I do think that the absenteeism piece is very real. It is, I do think, a byproduct of the ability of students to have learned to just shut things off for a couple of years. That became a very learned behavior. I'm struggling with something, I'll just shut it off. I'm at home and there's something going on, I'll just shut off school. And I do think that is real, and I hear that from a lot of my colleagues. But I do see that from a positive standpoint, and just in a review today of some disciplinary data. I'm in a school of about 600 students, which I know is small and has a very small sample size compared to a nation at large. But we have had 4 out-of-school suspension issues since the start of the school year. That is significantly lower than the last 2 or 3 years. And in fact, I could quadruple that number and it wouldn't be where we were a couple of years ago. So I see that as definitely, there's definitely a better feel in terms of the presence of school. And I think we're starting to see that perhaps turn around from an attendance standpoint. But at the same time, you do have people who are worried about being ill, being the one who causes other people to be ill. And it's a little bit more of a heightened anxiety on that part. I do think that, even things like this, there's more fluency with remote meetings and connecting with people in different ways that are all positives. And there are some things we did in those couple of years that got families engaged without having them in the building that have stayed as really strong practices. Getting comfortable with different technologies and not having as steep a learning curve. Those are all positives that we've been able to maintain. But the academic gap question, I think, is one of the bigger challenges that we're going to continue to address, because as Dr. Daniels just explained, for the kids that are starting high school, we have ninth graders who are in the building that missed out on some really significant time in middle school. For kids that are starting middle school, I have a daughter who's starting fifth grade this year. She missed out on a good chunk of kindergarten. And whether we're talking about the social or the academic curriculum, you do have some gaps. And I think we all have some gaps. So I think addressing those gaps just in calling them that and sharing where we're seeing struggles and not referring to them as pandemic centric has been a vernacular that we've had to adopt.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, I'm just going to pick up on a few things that you said, just as a follow-up. Dr. Daniels, with regard to the developmental delays that you're seeing that might have been caught earlier, and Dr. Rubin, you kind of alluded to some of these challenges too. This means that it requires some new things of educators in your school who may not, if you're middle school certified or high school certified teacher, you may not necessarily have been trained with the types of skills that are required for those students. How have you kind of managed that? I feel like that's a big challenge.
I'll start again. For us, and I'm in a school probably a little bit double the size of Mike. We have 1,600 students, so it is quite a large school. We have put, and our district has put a lot of emphasis on supporting students with social emotional funding, as far as getting more mental health workers, more counselors in the school. We have adopted in our particular school intervention period, which we refer to as Flex, which is something that we've been trying to get for a long time, but the need has increased. And so during that period, we can offer intervention for academics for students who need it. Teachers can red check or call in those students to have that support. But we also have counselors and mental health workers on board that are dealing with some of those behaviors and concerns we see. And so things that you may have expected of students, and Mike referred to it with his own daughter, not having those experiences socially in kindergarten and first grade, we are starting to see some of those behaviors more so popping up in middle school students. Just even getting frustrated over things that normally in middle school they would have worked through by that point with their peers. Lots of hands-on behavior that is middle school has hands-on behavior anyway, but even more so where they're just not even able to recognize each other's personal space, that need to, sorry, there's my school bell. I'm just full of sounds today. I apologize.
You're living the principal life.
We're living it. So those are kind of the things that we're seeing and that they're addressing in our district.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we actually have the eighth graders in my building, so I can certainly share the the hands-on-ziness of middle schoolers. I think it's an interesting point about the social emotional wellness and managing expectations for students. As school leaders, it's actually not all that different in talking about students as we would talk about staff. I've shared that to be, and this is part of my philosophy, and is that to be unequivocally student focused, you at some point have to be very staff focused. And I come from a coaching background, and it is really about finding what makes people tick and managing those expectations. The reality is that the job was already hard. And now managing some of those challenges and the emotional toll that educators as people have gone through over the past few years. They have to take care of their families. They have to take care of their own children or their relatives. And there's economic burdens and there's political burdens and there's all these anxieties. And that is something that is, I think, very different for school leaders now than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But we still have expectations and we still have standards. And I think that is one of the things that we keep returning to with our staff is if we want to focus on doing our best for the children, for the students in our care, we have to do our best for each other. And we have to do our best for the profession at large. And I think that's something that we've taken to task with as a leadership team, and we've looked at, okay, what are the specific supports that our teachers need? What are some of the interventions? What's the curriculum? What are some of the technological tools? What are some of the efficiencies? What can we do to put the learning in people's hands, so that they can do that the same way for students? And I do think it is a model, but you know, this is not something that anybody in the last, you know, I don't know, 100 years has been able to really comprehend from a standpoint of how they were trained to go into the business. So it's meeting the challenge in the here and now and figuring out what works, because that is something we can say we do.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you're talking about it as sort of a collaborative effort among your staff. I think that's what I heard, and trying to figure out what the efficiencies are. We just have a few more minutes, but I really want to give you the opportunity to respond to this question. If you were speaking to education policymakers or leaders and researchers, this is your moment, what would you like to share with them regarding pandemic recovery? You know, what do they need to know?
Can I jump in first on this one?
Sure.
We're tagging across the country. This is amazing. You couldn't have picked two geographically further apart principles, Greg. Unless Alaska were here. I do have to say that from a policy standpoint and thinking of the work we do in Washington, these problems are not zip code centric. It doesn't matter whether you're in a blue state, a red state, a purple state, a rural town, a suburban town, an urban city. It doesn't matter whether your kids are well-resourced, low income, first generation, or in the 1%. The problems that we see that have emerged in the last 5 years are universal. And this is not, an easy necessarily an easy fix. But I think that the stakeholders that are out there sometimes making decisions in what they believe is the best interest of things like education are not educators. So please listen to educators. Please listen to leaders. Listen to what we're seeing and saying, because, and I mean no disrespect by this, but like a bean counter in an office for a politician that is looking at test data doesn't know the story behind that, doesn't know what we're seeing. And I can tell you that if you talk to Dr. Daniels and I for 3 hours, we could both give you anecdotes about students and staff and people that are very, very, very real. And that's two really typical communities that could be placed anywhere. So, I come from Massachusetts. People talk about Massachusetts, say, oh yeah, there's the state. They always support education. And you know how our congressional policymakers are going to vote. But pandemic recovery is not a one-day moment. And it's not well, this is how previous generations did it, because it is so context dependent. And the one thing I will also say, and I've been sharing this a lot lately, is that familiarity does not mean functionality. Just because it's the way that you were familiar with how things might have worked at one time doesn't necessarily mean it's functional for today. Yeah. And we have to really be mindful of that.
Thank you.
I'll get off my soapbox now.
I appreciate
it.
I don't appreciate getting off the soapbox, but yeah. I appreciate the comment.
You have a great soapbox, because it is very true. And I think educators all across the United States would feel the same. Just talk to us. We're happy to share our stories and what we see day to day. I think there is no one size fits all. That local control does help a lot when we know our particular demographics and our particular needs at our school. Every school is different, even within the same district. 3 things I'm going to just say, and I'll say it quickly. One, you already alluded to, Susan, is the decline that we're finding and I come from a school district that's very well sought out. It was very difficult to hire teachers this year for subjects. Math, I had started the school with subs, and that I have never had to do that before in my career. I know others all have done it for a while, but we did this year. So we are seeing a lot of people not going into the profession, and that is concerning. And as well as the leadership in education. And I think because of the pandemic and also politically, we experience a lot of heightened anxiety from the community. And I've seen that probably being the biggest issue, dealing with families and parents since the pandemic, which leads me into my own doctoral research, which I won't talk about too much, but how we support parents so that they can support their students. I would say that's a stakeholder group that is often left out. And I think that we're seeing the effects on our kids by how their parents are dealing with things in society. And then third is SPED. Special education is really, really in need of support. We definitely aren't seeing as many people going into the special education field. And it is really impacting day to day. I would say probably in my experience right now, I am dealing more with special education than I ever have in my 40 years. And I was a special education teacher at one time. So the needs are really, really high. I think not only for all students, but for our special education students, we're seeing a lot of very heightened behaviors, and that could be due to what they experienced being apart from peers and from society during the pandemic. So those are my three areas that I would bring up: parents, SPED, and of course the retention and recruitment of teachers and staff.
Yes. Well, I just want to thank you so much for your honest insights into your day-to-day in the pandemic recovery. I really appreciate your participation. Thank you to Greg for introducing us to this. And with that, I am going to conclude our event. This event is a great example of the types of work that the Restart Network is doing. We strongly encourage you, if you are a practitioner, policymaker, or researcher, to please check us out, our website. We are also very, very interested in your opinions about this symposium. So we will definitely be putting a link to a survey. We really, really listen to what you tell us. So please let us know if you'd like to see something different, and or if you enjoyed the presenters today. I want to say I am humbled and personally thank all of the participants here. It is a great representation of the type of work we're trying to do and braid together in meaningful ways, and to create opportunities for all of these voices to come together to make a difference for students and for our educators. So thank you again, and have a great day.